everyone. Yeah, I'm really glad to be here at Google today. I think this is an excellent place to present the findings of the book, not least because I think Google also has an important role to play in countering some of the threats that we have seen arising on all sides of the extremist spectrum, from jihadist online radicalization campaigns to white nationalist and neo-Nazi campaigns. I think this is something that I find really important, and I do find the role that Google has been playing, but also hopefully will play in the future, something I will also probably highlight throughout the presentation where I do see potential. My goal initially for this book was to really get insights into the human dimensions, especially when talking about online extremist movements and online radicalization. These are phenomena where we often think about it almost as if it was a black box mechanism where someone all of a sudden becomes radicalized on an online platform. But we don't really think about what these new technologies, what social media do to us as individuals, to our identities on a personal level, but also on a group dimension. So I really wanted to get insights into the inner workings of such online movements that sometimes then also have a presence offline in the real world, and also see how their connections are between the online world and the offline world. And so I started doing this research around 2 years ago, or actually now 3 years ago. I went undercover with 12 different movements in total for 2 years. So I set up 5 different identities. I joined, for example, ISIS hacking groups. I joined jihadist bride groups. But I also joined groups on the neo-Nazi and far-right extremist side. For example, neo-Nazi groups in the US, but also I was also in the organization teams that were behind the Charlottesville rally in 2017 in the US, the white nationalist rally that ended in the death of one of the counter-protesters. And I was also in some of the networks that inspired the recent terrorist attacks in Christchurch, but also in the US and in Germany that we've seen over the past year. And some probably more fringe communities that I also joined were the female misogynist community of the Tradwives, a community I hadn't even really heard about, to be honest, before that. I hadn't really encountered them, having worked for 5 years in this field. That was something new to me, and it seemed almost like an oxymoron of encountering female misogynists. I will also tell you a bit about that community in a bit. And one last community that I found interesting to look at is the conspiracy theory networks, especially when looking at last week's attack in Germany, in Hanau. We're still seeing that the investigations are still ongoing, but from what we can find in the letter and in the documents that the attacker left behind, there is a strong overlap between the conspiracy theory communities and the elements that we find of conspiracy theories in his documents and the far-right, racist, white nationalist elements. So kind of a pattern that I found across all of these groups was the whole process of radicalization was kind of split up into 6 different stages. So it always started, of course, with recruiting. And then the next step, which was much more important than I thought it would be, was the socialization process, where actually some of the indoctrination and the ideological manipulation comes through a form of group cohesion that is created by almost completely new subcultures and countercultures that are taking shape, sometimes purely online, sometimes they're then also taking offline, but where these communities create their own vocabulary, their own insider references and jokes, and are able to really appeal to quite a wide range of different target audiences by sometimes gamifying the recruitment. So this stage of the socialization was really important, and I think that's also one of the key points that the book tries to highlight. But then, of course, also once people are socialized into extremist groups, they also start networking with like-minded groups across the globe. We've seen an internationalization of the phenomenon, with especially also, of course, online platforms, social media playing a big role in giving these fringe movements, sometimes very much locally rooted, actually a global platform, and allowing them to spread across the world. Last week's attack, the perpetrator spoke in English, addressed an American audience. Likewise, the Christchurch attacker last year, he also addressed an international community and had lots of these insider references in his live streamed video of the attack against mosques. And then the next stage is often public communication. And that's something where I was really shocked at times, being, for example, undercover with a neo-Nazi trolling army, how sophisticated the communication techniques are that extremists are using. Both, of course, we've seen that on the side of jihadists when ISIS has been using really sophisticated propaganda campaigns and has sometimes been tricking the algorithms to get their propaganda campaigns to a really wide audience, and where social media has sometimes lent these campaigns a megaphone and made some of the really small fringe movements appear much bigger than they actually are. And the same is true for the American alt-right, where they've staged really good, or good in terms of the communication strategy, really successful online campaigns in the run-up to the US election. And then in recent years, we've seen the European alt-right or the European new right copying and imitating some of these techniques, using memes and using sometimes satirical content to spread really vile ideologies. Then often we also see the next step, which is mobilization, kind of a mobilization to offline real-world protest movements, for example. We saw the Charlottesville rally in 2017, the white nationalist rally, but we also saw the riots, for example, in Chemnitz, in the German city of Chemnitz, where migrants were being chased in the streets. And actually the mobilization happened in encrypted messaging apps on Telegram, in some of these chat groups. Likewise, the Charlottesville rally organizers, I joined their organization teams that all took place on the gaming app Discord. So it is a cross-platform threat, because we then also, of course, see them sharing links to YouTube, links to Facebook and the bigger channels, carrying out some of the campaigns on Twitter. But sometimes it also takes place on these more fringe, either anonymous forums like 4chan, 8chan, or in the encrypted messaging apps. And the last stage, unfortunately, also sometimes happens, of course not in all of the cases, not in all of the groups that I looked at, is attack. And either in the form of real-world attacks, like the wave of attacks that we saw especially coming from far-right terrorists in recent months, or on the jihadist side, and also hacking campaigns and attacks that purely take place in the online world, including phenomena like doxing, the leaking of private details, and the hacking of infrastructure. I'd like to give you a few examples or kind of insights into these different stages by mentioning some of the stories and some of the people that I encountered in these movements, both from the online and offline undercover experiences. In the first stage, recruitment, I joined, I first was recruited into the white nationalist network of Generation Identity. My goal with this was to get more insights into how their recruitment campaigns worked, how they made, what kind of people would join that movement. And this one was quite an interesting example, because Generation Identity is now a pan-European movement that has been quite skillful in recruiting very young, sometimes very educated members into their networks. And I had already built up my online identity in some of their chat groups. I was already present and could see that they were planning to open an offshoot in the UK and Ireland. So I wanted to get insights into what their next steps would be for recruiting new British members. And so I reached out to them. I submitted kind of an application, was invited for an interview first in Vienna, because I also kind of posed to be an Austrian exchange student in London, so that I could build that bridge between continental Europe and the UK. And then I was invited to join their first secret strategy meeting in an Airbnb in Brixton. And it was incredible to see how standardized their branding is. So they had influencers and leading members of Generation Identity offshoots from France, Germany, Austria, all come together to this London launch to brief new members about their communication tactics, about how to run slick online campaigns and do offline stunts that then can be live streamed and go viral on social media. They're also still up and running on YouTube, just as a small remark. I do think that they are a movement that operates kind of in the gray zone, so that's something difficult, of course, to challenge from a policy side, from a legal perspective, and also from the tech company side. It is it's also remarkable that they know how to rebrand themselves to kind of stay away from the traditional neo-Nazi and Holocaust denial content and from any kind of explicit violence incitement. And they even briefed their members on how to respond to tough questions from journalists. For example, if they're asked, are you anti-Semitic, are you racist? They have answers ready to reply to them. And that this challenge of rebranding, we also see that, of course, in their online materials, and that makes it hard to tackle their online content. Maybe another example from another group that I joined in the US, actually a neo-Nazi group that was operating on the gaming app Discord. They had introduced even more rigid vetting procedures and recruitment procedures, especially after they found out that a lot of investigative journalists and security forces had infiltrated their channels after the Charlottesville rally and after the threat from the far right became more evident. And so they, for example, asked me to submit a timestamp picture of my wrist to prove that I'm white, or they also asked members to submit the results of a genetic test. And so it was quite, I mean, they're taking it to the next level. They are using like different, completely new forms of online recruitment, actually. They never met in person, but it does show how connected also some of these groups are with the newest technologies, even with genetic test results and things like that. And a lot of it is also gamified now, both recruitment but also communication and propaganda campaigns. And one of the most shocking examples of this was a neo-Nazi trolling army. We see quite a few of those, but a neo-Nazi trolling army that I joined in Germany that had 10,000 members at a certain stage, and in the run-up to the last German elections was quite successful in completely manipulating and twisting the online discourse by coordinating campaigns in, again, closed channels on Discord, where they, for example, would agree on a time, for example, say, tonight at 7 p.m., everyone attacks this political opponent on Twitter or on Facebook. And they would be very effective, even if they were only a few thousand members who were participating in those campaigns. They made an impression that actually catapulted their hashtags, for example, into the top trends in Germany in the 2 weeks run-up to the German elections. And by doing that, they can, of course, exercise a lot of pressure on individuals that they try to silence, intimidate, on their critics, on journalists, but they can also twist some of the political discussions into a direction that they want to have or they want to see. And similarly, I also experienced more on a personal level how much force or power such campaigns can have. I published an article that was now 2 years ago in The Guardian where I mentioned by name the English defense founder Tommy Robinson, who you might have heard of, and I mentioned him as an example, or his Twitter account as an example of how white supremacist movements have increasingly become mainstreamed. And on the day after I published this article, he came to my then office. Back then I was working for Quilliam, the counter-extremism think tank, and he barged into our office and live streamed the whole confrontation to his back then 300,000 followers on Twitter. And this was, of course, followed by a massive hate and harassment campaign. And it led to, in effect, to my dismissal from the organization, because I was asked to retract my statements from the article, to publicly say I regret having written that article. And I refused to do that, so I was dismissed a few days after that. And this shows how much power an individual, even if it's an influencer, a far-right influencer, can have over entire organizations. And this is just one example out of many journalists that I also interviewed for the book who have faced similar campaigns after they criticized extremists. Extremists, of course, from all sides, but the far-right in particular has been very good at leading these communication and intimidation campaigns. And yeah, it is something where we've seen quite a concerning trend that also now increasingly artists, political activists, researchers, journalists, and politicians are being attacked by such coordinated campaigns. And we also saw in the UK that some of the female, especially female, politicians are facing quite a lot of threats, and recently that led some of the female MPs to even not take part in the election, in the run-up to the election when they were facing these threats. So it can have a big political impact. One thing I forgot to mention, but that is quite interesting from the whole gamification perspective, is that you can see on the left, this is the way that Reconquista Germanica, this German neo-Nazi trolling army, structured their own operations, was almost in military-like hierarchies, where you were rewarded for carrying out a particularly successful campaign, for example, against political opponents. They even gave military-like names to some of their forms of attacks. So they would call an online attack on a political opponent a sniper mission, or they would use all of these names to really incentivize people to take part in these campaigns and see it almost as a game. So here you had the hierarchy showing the supreme commander, who would then give orders to the foot soldiers of this trolling army. And this is quite similar to the ways that other trolling armies also in other geographies are working. Networking. The next stage, for the next stage, I looked at the cross-platform ecosystem that we've seen emerge in recent years. There's a whole range of new platforms that extremists have partly created by themselves, or ultra-libertarian platforms that have been used for extremist purposes, because they wouldn't cooperate with the authorities. They wouldn't remove even the most extreme content or violence-inciting content. There's a whole range of platforms that would fall into that category. For example, Gab or Minds have become alternative social media platforms that are now turning into hotbeds, or have turned into hotbeds for extremists. Then there are also platforms that have been hijacked by extremists, like the gaming app that I mentioned, like Discord, or also other apps. In the case of jihadists, for example, the content sharing platform Just Pasted, which essentially was a one-man business, was hijacked by jihadists for their propaganda. So something similar also occurred on the jihadist side. And increasingly, they've also been building their own in-house tools, where they create encryption methods or their own apps, chat apps. For example, Generation Identity has been trying to create its own communication tool, which they called Patriot Peer, which would be almost a mixture of a Tinder for Nazis, it's been called like that, and just a simple social media app or chat app. And then there are also other platforms, like alternative crowdsourcing platforms. After some of the extremists had their accounts closed by Patreon, by the crowdsourcing platform Patreon, they created the platform Hatreon, which has now luckily been removed, but that shows how innovative they get with creating their own platforms. There are also alternative dating platforms. And this is a whole new universe that is, I would say, posing a completely new challenge, because we see that a lot of the policy responses right now are focusing on the bigger mainstream platforms that are known to everyone. And I do think that there's a really important role to play for these, because these are often used as initial ground to recruit members into these smaller platforms. That's also why it's so important that extremist material gets quickly removed from platforms like YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. But these alternative platforms sometimes have been a bit under the radar of the security forces and of the policymakers and lawmakers in recent years. And for example, the NetzDG legislation, the first anti-hate speech law in Germany, only concerns companies or platforms with over 2 million users, which a lot of these platforms wouldn't reach, because they're smaller fringe platforms that nevertheless have really attracted a really high amount and a high concentration of extremist content. The next chapter, the next kind of part, is about mobilization. So I went to a neo-Nazi rock and mixed martial arts festival, which is probably the biggest in Europe, at the border of Germany and Poland. And it was one of the experiences where I, for the first time, realized that actually online platforms and social media also now plays a role for these quite traditional neo-Nazi networks that in my head were not really connected to any of these new technologies, because they're still a lot of these people, contrary to the newer far-right movements and the jihadist movements, they are still quite traditional in the way that they look. Not everyone, but a lot of them are still wearing the typical skinhead outfits. They're organized in a more locally rooted way than some of these international loose networks of extremists, whether that's in the form of ISIS and Al-Qaeda cells or in the form of alt-right networks on the internet. And these guys there were surprisingly, a lot of the people who participated at that event that I spoke to had actually become aware of this whole scene by looking at the rock or mixed martial arts videos, for example, on YouTube. And that was something that only then I connected this to this very traditional movement, where they've now managed to attract higher numbers at these European festivals, with people coming from Poland, coming from other countries in Europe to join this neo-Nazi festival in Germany. So also in this case, I do think that we're seeing new developments and where online platforms and tech firms can play a big role in countering that and in tackling some of the content that is actually trying to hijack hobbies, sometimes radicalizes people who might not even be politically interested or ideologically tainted. So they're kind of going through either the music angle or the mixed martial arts angle or the gaming angle. And they're attracting new members through these different gateways. So I think it's really important for these gateways to have a good policy regarding these. Of course, not shutting down content that isn't explicitly extremist or harmful or violence inciting, but it is important to watch out for these manipulative techniques that extremists are using. Another example is brands. Also, something I came across at the festival was Nipster brands or Nazi hipster brands. So they've now also, for example, created a lot of online shops where they sell T-shirts with slightly twisted swastikas. In Germany, as you know, it's forbidden to have any kind of neo-Nazi symbols, and so they're trying everything to circumvent existing laws to create an attractive or appealing counterculture movement that uses hip and new elements of existing, for example, fashion or arts movements, and integrates their ideologies into that. And finally, the last stage, attack. That's one of the turning points for me in writing the book, and I had already pretty much finished the book at this stage, was when pretty much exactly 1 year ago, the attack happened in Christchurch in New Zealand, where the perpetrator carried out 2 separate shootings at 2 mosques in Christchurch and live streamed his attack. And it was it was really shocking to then reading his so-called manifesto or the documents that he had left behind and finding so many elements that I had encountered 1,000-fold in some of these online networks. A lot of these subculture trolling elements, a lot of satire and jokes that he referenced, where he really tried to appeal to this sub-community, to this small, relatively small community, but international community, and where even the video itself was shot from almost like a first-person ego shooter angle, and was an attempt to get the applause from that audience. And this also worked, as we could then see in the aftermath. The video was turned into several versions where, for example, terribly, people then gave points for every Muslim that was shot in new versions that were created and circulated of this video. And that also is really dangerous in terms of inspiring copycat attacks, because that made it all seem like a game. And you could observe how some people who were then commenting on this live stream video couldn't even grasp that this was actually really happening. So the lines have become so blurry between what is real, what is just an online game, and what's actually the real world. And there is a big responsibility for any tech firm, for any online platform, I think, to also consider these new forms of online identities, online communities, and group dynamics that are taking shape, and to address some of these subculture elements. And for example, the first comment beneath the live streamed video was saying, is this a LARP? Is this a live action role play? So you could tell this is not, this person can't really grasp that this is actually happening. And then the next attack happened a few weeks, I think it was only, or a few months later in Poway, at the synagogue in Poway, and then in El Paso a few weeks after that, and then we had the attack in Germany, in Halle, and then now we had the latest attacks in Hanau, the latest attack in Hanau last week, and a lot of these attacks, or at least the ones up to Halle, all followed a very similar pattern and even referenced the previous attacks. So it was a new form of copycat terrorism, very similar to the copycat or inspirational terrorism that we saw in previous years, inspired by ISIS networks, where we also had one attack after another with similar elements. And the gamification elements were present in almost all of these far-right terrorist attacks. After the attack happened in Poway, the first comment also, again, beneath the post read, get the high score, again in reference to video games. So there's this recurring pattern, and there's a real danger of gamified terrorism occurring, not just on the far-right side of the spectrum, but also in other in other extremist movements. Christchurch was really the first, I'd say, example where we didn't just see gamified recruitment. ISIS had used that previously in campaigns, or gamified propaganda, even using sometimes language like the call for duty when referring to jihad, mixing gaming language with jihadist language. But this was the first case of the actual act of terrorism being gamified. The other future threat that I want to point to, having been in one of these ISIS hacking groups, were actually they were not very sophisticated, but there were two teachers who tried to teach us in this group hacking skills to then hack Western infrastructure. And they did manage, or everything pointed to the fact that they were also involved in the hacking of hundreds of schools in the US that were being hacked. I did forward that. Whenever I saw something threatening, I obviously forwarded it to the responsible authorities to investigate. But there were reports then of up to 800 US schools who had their websites hacked and replaced with ISIS propaganda. And this was quite an easy, low skill hacking. But there's so many websites and also in general infrastructure devices that still use the default passwords like admin12345, that they were able to exploit that. And now in this case, no one died, nothing serious happened. It's still bad enough, I think, for parents to send, no one wants to send their child to a school that had just been hacked by ISIS. So it did create that fear on a psychological level. But there could also in the future, of course, be more severe hacking campaigns carried out by extremists that would go against critical infrastructure. So these are, I would say, some of the future threats. Other threats would come from other new technologies, especially deepfake technologies, where it's possible to completely manipulate videos in retrospect, make politicians say something they never said, or AI-based text production tools where you can produce texts that look exactly like they were written by a famous journalist, whereas actually they were completely AI produced. So these things can really be, of course, exploited and used by extremists to lead disinformation campaigns. And finally, I think in terms of solutions, I know this is all quite a pessimistic outlook, but I am quite positive in the long run. I think I'm quite pessimistic in the short run because we're still in the very early stages of tackling this problem. I know that Google and YouTube have taken steps, especially in the last year. I can even just going on my extremist YouTube account, I can see a difference in terms of the recommendations, the content recommendations. I can see that there have been some changes with some extremist content being taken down. Actually, across a lot of the bigger platforms, this has happened, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, we've worked also with Google, with Facebook, also with policymakers to tackle this challenge. Ultimately, I do think there's a responsibility for tech platforms to really take proactive action, and I'd love to see more of that, also of, for example, supporting civil society-led initiatives that might tackle some of what we find in the gray zone areas where we can't really use policies because we don't want to have policies that might be might look like infringements on freedom of speech. So there's a lot of content that is, of course, can be considered harmful, but doesn't fall into an illegal space, where I think there's a real role for companies like Google to play to support some of the civil society initiatives. I know that Google is already doing some of this, but there are always new pilot projects that I think need a lot of support, especially new intervention models that might also tackle some of these online subcultures on the fringes or in the darker corners of the internet. But because this is such a cross-platform threat where some of it might be actually sometimes beneath a YouTube video, there might be a link shared to a smaller platform that then leads people to go there. I saw this quite often, that people recruited on the main platforms to then lead people into these darker echo chambers and lead people into these encrypted forums. So yeah. On a positive note, I think in the long run, this is something we can tackle, and I do see lots of great civil society initiatives. At IST, we've worked on with Google on the Global Impact Challenge, and I think there are initiatives that are appearing that are good, but we still need to put a lot of effort, and I think thinking into how we tackle these online extremist echo chambers. Thank you. Yeah, questions?
When you have to immerse yourself in so much darkness, how do you maintain who you are and your own beliefs? How do you stay positive, basically?
To be very honest, it was sometimes difficult to distance myself and also to switch between the different identities, because of course, especially remaining a presence in these online channels also means it's hard to then be away for a week or completely step away from this. During the time of the different undercover investigations, I had to be present in the groups. So that was that, and it still is challenging. And I think a lot of people who deal with these dark subjects, also when monitoring propaganda materials, underestimate the longer term creeping impacts and traumatizing effects this can have on our psyche. In the end, it also gave me a bit of hope, because I could also see the human dimensions, even in the most extreme of the extremist channels and chat groups, and among the very extremist propagandists. I could still find some kind of common ground where I think this could be really used as a starting point for new intervention models in online spaces. Because a lot of, and this was also one of the aims of the book, was to essentially also show that these online subcultures have a lot of human dimensions to them, where hopefully we can start at these and also address some of the fears that are very present in these communities. But yeah, I agree. It is. I think at times it was difficult, and sometimes I also thought maybe I've gone too far. Maybe I should stop this whole project right now.
Did you, in your experience, ever find the experience actually like seductive, like you started to sympathise or you started to feel like you were going down a path? The reason I ask is, I guess if you consider yourself someone who thinks about all these things, you know, you wouldn't be swayed by it, and it's normally kind of the vulnerable or someone looking for something. But is it actually this kind of thing is seductive to everybody, and you felt sometimes you might go too far, as you say?
Absolutely. Even before starting this research, I didn't really believe in any kind of profiling or in extremist profiles. I still think that anyone can be attracted to different forms of extremist movements in weak or vulnerable moments. But even more so, I started to really feel that and get that sense after I was actually also at one point, I would say not at the verge, but I could feel how I was being drawn into a community. And that was, I briefly just mentioned them in the beginning, but that was that female misogynist community where I consider myself quite liberal and quite really on the other side of the ideological spectrum. And yet when I spent a lot of time in this community and they were addressing grievances and topics that I could relate to. It was not like in the jihadist channels and also in the neo-Nazi channels, I couldn't really identify myself with much of what they were discussing there. But in that channel, they were talking about challenges that mattered to me as well on an emotional level. I was also in quite a vulnerable position at the time when I did this particular investigation. But so they were, for example, addressing double burdens in modern lives of women today, or the challenges of the so-called hookup culture or online dating apps. These were things that also seemed like a challenge to me, and the way that they provided really easy solutions and also formed kind of a community that helped, where women helped each other, I can see how this can be appealing, especially at difficult times, but for anyone. There were people in all of these groups, there were people from different educational backgrounds, from different socioeconomic backgrounds, also from different age groups. Of course, some groups focus more, for example, on younger audiences. Some groups try to tap into the socioeconomic injustices and would rather address working class communities. But overall, there seemed to be no profile.
Thank you for presentation. It was very interesting, and honestly, I admire the courage, because we all have curiosity but not enough courage to investigate on this. My question was regarding the screenshot that we saw when you went to the interview with Generation Identity, I think, when they discovered that you were Julia Ebner. So how did it happen that they discovered? Was it at the moment when you were interviewed or after? And when your name was exposed on the social media, did you get any threats? And the second question, did you really get some, so I assume you get loads of threats, but how do you cope with it? Do you get paranoid when you get like a huge amount of threats? And did you have situations when you had to go to the police fearing for your life? Thank you.
I definitely did get paranoid at times, and I did have quite a lot of campaigns in the past. Whenever there's a new publication, I do already mentally prepare for new waves of threats. Usually it comes and goes in waves, but waves of, usually, I mean, they can range, right? They can be harassment and trolling campaigns, or they can be serious death and sexual threats. And I've had both, and I think there are quite a lot of civil society organizations that offer help now, or especially, for example, in Germany, there's an organization called Hate Aid, or an initiative called Hate Aid, that's actually trying to help vulnerable people, and that's now journalists, political activists, even artists who might become targeted by these harassment or intimidation campaigns. I do think that there's a real need for that in other geographies as well. But after being exposed, and that happened a few times, that's not a nice feeling, of course, and there was a campaign, but I did know that there was always an expiry date, because I also, in this case, in the Generation Identity case, they actually exposed me quite quickly after these meetings, because I then published a report at ISD looking at Generation Identity more generally, but looking at their mobilization campaigns, and they read pretty much everything about themselves, because branding and reputation and their image matters to them. So they matched my name with my fake identity. And and I was also, not all of the extremist movements that I looked at or that I went undercover with made it into the book, because for some of them I was just kicked out too quickly of, for example, some of the online channels, because they exposed my identity, or they exposed that I was an infiltrator too quickly.
So just following on from that point, can you talk a bit about how and when you reported activity, so how you kind of balance the need to report potentially illegal activity you came across with the desire to keep your anonymity and the need to protect your anonymity, but also not give away the fact there was a mole on some of these groups?
So in general, I would report anything that's a concrete threat, or where I see someone, of course, if I see someone plotting an attack or plotting even a hacking campaign or something like that, I did immediately report it to, if I could tell which geography they were in, to the responsible authorities. That's not always straightforward, because of course sometimes you just don't know where these people are based even. And also to the tech firms. So sometimes I flagged content if it was being spread on a big platform, and I want to reduce the damage. I would flag. We would, in general, at ISD, we have a policy of flagging really violence-inciting content to the tech platforms on which it happens. Then there were cases, of course, where when reporting about extremists in general, I tried to keep everyone's privacy, especially of non-public figures. I wouldn't mention their full names. I wouldn't mention any details, any personal details, because I also want to leave the option for all of these people to actually get back into mainstream society. And I do think that can have a counterproductive effect if then the media reports their full names, and also gives them that additional platform, but also prevent some of the newer members to actually leave the movement, because they already have their face out there then.
So it's really positive to actually hear you saying, you're optimistic about, what's to come and all the preventative things that are being done by companies like Google and so on. And you touched on it actually in terms of people who are trying to go back into mainstream society. And there have been instances in the media of people who have tried to and they've faced loads of backlash. So my question is there anything you think that maybe companies or even like individuals or communities can do to help those who are trying to leave these extremist groups and trying to go back into mainstream society and not face this backlash?
You mean the normal people on social media, like civil society or users?
Yeah, just in general, or just even like tech companies.
I'd say that's one of the goals was also with the book to just raise awareness about the different techniques that are used by extremists. So for everyone to be able to protect themselves from buying into a piece of disinformation or from being targeted by or from being impacted by either manipulation campaigns or also radicalization campaigns or intimidation or manipulation campaigns. But beyond that, I do think that everyone has a responsibility, just like we intervene sometimes in offline settings and we show civil courage in offline settings, to show the same amount of civil courage online. And I'm not seeing that yet to the same extent. Someone would intervene in most scenarios. Someone would intervene if someone's aggressed or attacked on the tube, for example, on the basis of their race, religion, or whatever. Most bystanders would somehow intervene, say something, and that's not really happening to the same extent yet on social media or in online spaces. So I hope that in the future that there will be a bit more of online civil courage that we're seeing.
Thank you. This is more sort of a statement, but I'm curious on your opinion. Is the problem here the fact that we have extremist point of views as a species, or is the problem here the fact that it's secret? So, i.e., if we'd not let these people be secret and actually welcome them in society and accepted that people will have these extreme points of views and that's just the way life is, would it then be that because they're not secret anymore, it doesn't build into the next stages of each stage, if you know what I mean, ultimately into attack? Because if you, again, it's just the thought. I mean, because, yeah, just welcome your thought.
It's difficult. I think it's a very tricky relationship. There have also been initial studies that try to, for example, look at the correlation between having these views in more mainstream settings, actually having far-right populist parties, sometimes even echoing these echo chambers and ideologies, using the same language in parliaments. I would say overall from the observations that we've made, it usually gives the really extreme fringes a platform. It gives them justification, additional legitimacy. It usually helps them to further spread their ideologies and to further also incite to violence. But there are studies that say the opposite is true, that providing them with a political solution might decrease the risk of people resorting to violent means. I haven't seen enough evidence to back that claim, to be honest, but it's a very, I think, multifaceted relationship. In the end, I think it is about some of the conspiracy theories that clearly propagate an existential threat to an in-group that might then motivate individuals to resort to violent action, almost as they would see it as a defensive action, whether that's in the form of a defensive jihad that's done in response to a perceived threat from the West against Islam, or whether that's in the form of almost this accelerationist ideologies and that the far-right and the white supremacist movements have shown, where they try to accelerate what they would see as a coming race war, or this existential threat of the idea of a great replacement, that was actually driving some of the last far-right terrorists, where they think that white populations are being gradually wiped out or replaced by people with migration backgrounds. I mean, these conspiracy theories are dangerous because they are presenting an idea of an imminent threat that must be countered with action. And I think having those, I don't think it is, it's a good idea to give them an additional platform or to have them normalized within society. I do think it's important to tackle those. But the boundaries are fluid, right? It's such a difficult question of where to draw the line of what should still be considered freedom of speech. It was the same within those female misogynist communities, where you could argue that some of their views are just being ultra-conservative, or they want to go back to traditional gender roles of the 1950s or earlier than that, which I mean, everyone can hold that view, but some of them were also feeding into the misogynist networks of the manosphere movement, where you could see that, for example, the incels movement has given rise to violent attacks and to terrorist attacks against women. And some of them were also endorsing domestic violence. And these things can have real-world implications and can be quite tricky on a threat level, I think.
So as you continue educating yourself and become an expert within this area, you know, I assume, I don't want to assume, but I assume that you're learning how to digest it and cope with it. And as you've just been able to explain it, and to a lot of us, it's very mind-blowing, some of what we've heard. What has been, or do you think could potentially be, the most mind-blowing experience, as you already are very familiar with this and understand the psyche behind it? Like, I'm curious, what would still shake you up if you learned about or saw?
That's a very difficult question, because it's usually the things that are unpredictable in a certain sense that are the most mind-blowing, that were the most mind-blowing things in this case of the research here. It was, for example, this female misogynist community was something that I found shocking, because I'd never encountered it. I thought female misogynist sounded like an oxymoron to me. But then also when Christchurch happened, we were at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. We'd been warning of the gamification elements that were used in extremist movements for years, and also had been warning about some of the hijacking of trolling culture and memes by extremists. But seeing that really manifest itself in a real-world attack of that scale was something I found really shocking. And but that was something, it was, in that sense, it was not a surprise, but it was still such a shock, because it's, so I think probably when I look at the future threats that could be kind of foreseeable or could be predictable, I would say that a large-scale hack that really targets critical infrastructure could be something that would be quite shocking and would have a huge impact, of course. I don't really see this happening in the near future, because I don't think there are that many people within those extremist networks that have the hacking skills to do it. But the same could be true for really sophisticated use of deep fakes and really running large-scale disinformation campaigns. But I'd say that government actors are more likely to have the capacity and the knowledge to run such campaigns. I think obviously government use of these technologies is also something that I wouldn't underestimate. I actually consulted 10 counterterrorism experts on what they would see as the future, the most likely future threats almost the last chapter. The last chapter focuses on more positive side solutions, but a lot of them were also warning of government-led terrorism or state-led terrorism. And there might also be new forms of terrorism. To be honest, an anti-tech movement is something I consider increasingly likely, seeing how much hatred has built up against big tech firms, against technology in general, because so many people have a grievance, and often rightly so, of course, but that could also turn into a more violent movement. And yeah, these are things that we might not necessarily see coming in the next few months, but maybe in the future.
I just wonder what your views are in relation to whether you think as a society, the mainstream media, etc., might have a blind spot for right supremacism and right extremism. And we are focusing excessively on Islamist fundamentalism. And we might be normalizing some of the more extreme views of the far right.
Yeah, I'd say we're now seeing, in many countries, we're seeing a shift. I think the last year, especially since Christchurch, looking back exactly over that last year, we saw a lot more policymakers and also media outlets, tech firms step up their efforts in terms of also countering white supremacist and far-right extremist propaganda and campaigns. There's still a big time lag, and I'm wondering if we're overlooking. The problem is that, of course, it's such a fluid space where extremists move to different platforms quite quickly and build up new networks. And the problem is also that a lot of the security-led efforts and also the policies usually focus on national borders, whereas this movement is most of these networks are so international that they could rather be compared to ISIS kind of cell networks or to Al-Qaeda linked networks. And that's a problem because our definition, or most of the countries, actually all of the countries' definitions that I'm aware of currently, consider far-right extremism still as a domestic violence problem. And there's no, even for example, on the list on the terrorist list of the United Nations, you only see Al-Qaeda and ISIS affiliated movements. You don't see far-right extremist global networks. But also we're seeing new structures of these networks that are more loose international networks, not really traditional hierarchical movements with local roots, or not in all cases. And that requires a whole new definition and an international approach to this. Because otherwise, it's a bit like in the case when National Action was banned here in the UK. Actually now the Home Secretary just announced the bans of two other movements today or yesterday. But when National Action was banned as the first far-right terrorist group in the UK in 2016, Twitter blocked all of the propaganda, all of the National Action propaganda for the UK. But people could still circumvent that by using VPNs, or people in the US from Atomwaffen Division, for example, could still access that material because it was a national response to an international problem.
I just think that even the language that we use is important, and if there is a Islamist attack, everybody very quickly labels the individual as a terrorist. And when there are attacks, and very recently there are attacks from the far right, and we are very hesitant to label people as terrorists, we tend to identify them as lone wolves or individuals with mental health problems. And I view that as deeply problematic.
Absolutely, I completely agree, and that was also the case in the recent attacks, even last week in Hanau in Germany. At least judging from the materials that the perpetrator left behind, of course there might always be a case of mental illness playing a role among a high proportion of terrorists. Also on the jihadist side. But in this case, that dimension was highlighted in some media reports and also by some political voices, whereas actually when looking at the materials, they were explicitly ideologically rooted in some conspiracy theories. There were clearly racist and even genocidal language and references in the letter that he left behind. And I'd agree that it's dangerous to highlight, to have an inconsistent approach to naming and highlighting specific topics and angles for one kind of extremism, but not for the other. And I'd say that that's a big part of the problem that also, of course, is exacerbated by seeing more and more political parties with far-right populist views being represented in leading government positions and in parliaments. Thank you.